Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This is Apostolos Magiriadis from Sky Television. I'm very happy and I'm honored to present the next panel here at the Delphi Forum. It's titled How We Can Ensure a More Inclusive Global Recovery, and it is an honor and a privilege to host tonight Professor Joseph Stίγκλιτς. He's a Nobel Prize laureate and he teaches at Columbia University in the city of New York. Professor Stίγκλitz, it's an honor and a pleasure to see you again. It's been some time since we saw each other, and hopefully when the pandemic is over, we'll be happy to host you here in Delphi or in Athens or at the symposium that you usually come as a guest of Mr. Papandreou. Hello from Athens. I'm also joined with the ex-Prime Minister and the President of Socialist International, Mr. George Papandreou. Mr. Papandreou, thank you very much for
Thank you very much, Apostole.
This is a great opportunity because tonight we're going to discuss how we can ensure a more inclusive global recovery. It's a good opportunity that we have both of you on board. I know that you chat on a regular basis, Mr. Papandreou, with Professor Stίγκλιτς. Now it's an opportunity to listen to him. So I'll start my first question with Professor Stίγκλitz, and I would like to ask you, last week marked Joe Biden's first 100 days in office, the period when presidents historically try to push ambitious agendas. And how would you evaluate his record so far in terms of managing the COVID-19 crisis and also putting down a $2 trillion relief package? And what do you think it signals for progressive politics around the world?
It's been an impressive 100 days. I think the $1.9 trillion, that's a lot of money in anybody's calculus, is well designed for getting America going again. The estimates of our growth are somewhere between 6.5% and 8%. So while there's a lot of uncertainty, especially concerning the global recovery, I think President Biden has set the agenda extremely well, especially in the political context in which Republicans are resisting absolutely everything. If you look at the design of the $1.9 trillion package, it's also very impressive because the United States faces a number of problems. We don't want to go back to where we were in January 2020. The virus has exposed exacerbated the inequalities in our society, has reminded us that we haven't been doing what we should be doing about climate change and a number of other problems. In 1 year, his program is estimated to reduce childhood poverty by 50%. That's an extraordinarily impressive achievement. Now, of course, the long-term recovery will depend on what further legislation he's going to be able to get through, infrastructure, what he calls the Family Cares Act. These are very important pieces of legislation if we're really going to be able to build back better.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Papandreou, we have seen some similar tactics in Europe with the recovery plan, and I wonder whether there will be some kind of a spillover effect from what's going on in the US. I wonder if it's a signal that the recovery plan in Europe is engaging to a more progressive horizon, politically and economically, contrary to what was the case probably 10 years ago during the crisis.
Thank you. Europe has to learn from this experience and see that Biden is a shining example of what politics can do when you have a different politics, when you have progressive politics, when you have a different approach, and think with greater boldness and with greater imagination. Biden was considered to be a candidate who was somewhat weak and maybe not so prepared for as far as his age and so on. And I think people have, I know him very well, and he's very experienced. And I think, in fact, his age has given him a boldness to take steps that he doesn't really have to think of the political costs, but he also knows that there are steps that will really help the country. And as Joe, my good friend Joe Stίγklitz has said, he has really made inroads, and the issues of climate, going back to the climate Paris Agreement, dealing with the pandemic and supporting the whole health system, have a huge recovery package, dealing with poverty, and of course the whole infrastructure and tax issues that he's talking about, taxing the rich. And we in Europe need to see this. 10 years ago, many of these issues, Joe remembers, we used to talk about the Eurobonds and the possible need for fighting tax havens and financial transaction taxes and so on. The stimulus package for climate, that was 10 years ago, but nothing really happened. Had we done something then, the financial crisis would have been dealt with much more effectively, and we would not have had so much pain as we had. And from that pain, of course, we've had not only the recession, but political changes, a lot of demagoguery, a lot of xenophobia, a lot of tensions inside Europe. So I think now Europe is taking much better measures. There is still much to be done. And we are facing a huge transformation. That is the green transformation, the transformation towards a green, sustainable deal. And hopefully, this will be a much more progressive program, although Europe is still dominated by somewhat conservative parties and views.
Still, we're talking about a paradigm shift, which is very important, I guess, both for the US and also for Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Papandreou, for this. Professor Stίγklitz, I'm turning back to you. Let's talk about the pandemics and the pandemic and the issue of the vaccines' intellectual rights. And it's another issue where we had an act from President Biden. How do you evaluate his support to waive intellectual property protections for the coronavirus vaccines? I know this is an issue that you have written extensively, you have discussed extensively, and I'm sure you're happy about it. But also, what's the response to pharmaceuticals who claim this could have devastating effects to vaccine production?
Nonsense is what I say to the pharmaceutical industries. They're getting thousands% return on their investment. The government provided tens of billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical companies. The problem with the pharmaceutical companies is excessive greed. They want tens of thousands of percent returns on their investment, not just hundreds of percent returns on their investment. The principle that we're talking about is already agreed internationally. We agreed to it back in the beginning of this century when, in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there was an agreement about compulsory licenses. And the United States even threatened to invoke that in the case of anthrax. The problem is that the process of issuing these compulsory licenses is very slow. The drug companies have figured out how to stall things. And in this context, delay is very, very costly. While the world is going through transaction costs and delays, the virus remains devastating parts of the world, like India. And worse, mutations arise, and those mutations can come back and hurt us. Now, of course, if they come back, the drug companies can make even more money, but we need to protect ourselves. And so the issue of getting a fair return is not at dispute. When you issue a compulsory license, when you issue this waiver, it's not waiving the payment of fees. It's just saying you go ahead to all the producers in the developing countries and developed countries, go ahead and do whatever you can to produce it as fast as you can. Now, the really interesting thing is the inconsistency of the pharmaceutical companies, because they say the companies, the countries don't have the capacity. If they don't have the capacity, nothing's going to happen. But it's only if they have the capacity that things will happen. And the fact that the drug prices went down after Biden made his announcement is evidence that the market thinks this will make a difference. And all the evidence I've seen makes it clear that it will make a very big difference. And that was why I was joined by over 80 Nobel Prize winners and over 80 former statesmen in making a plea that there should be a waiver of these intellectual property rights.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this is something that President Biden will be able to pass through Congress?
He doesn't have to go through Congress. It has to go through the WTO. Mm-hmm. And, some of the European leaders say, well, there are other things that ought to be done, like the elimination of export restraints and more money for COVAX to provide vaccines to developing countries. Absolutely right. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all our problems. But it is an important step, a necessary step, and it will make a difference. So we have to do everything. This is a real emergency. There's a real urgency to this. And I am, quite frankly, very disappointed with the drug companies that they're continuing to drag their feet, and with some of the European countries that are raising issues, important issues like making sure that more money is provided to the developing countries and emerging markets, and restraints on exported ingredients are removed. Those are all important. But let's also make sure that everybody can have access to these intellectual property rights.
You gave me a very good pass to George Papandreou by referring to Europe, and I'm coming to you, Mr. President. Europe was not as bold as the US was towards that issue. Do you sense that in the end we will see again that spillover effect as it did with the recovery plan? Will it be influenced by developments in the US? And how do you see Europe again coming with different views on the issue?
President Biden created a positive shock in the pharma world, if you like, that saying that we have to do whatever it takes, what Draghi would have said, maybe 10 years ago, because we have to realize that no one is safe until everyone is safe. That's what the pandemic is. And I agree very much with Joe Stίγklitz, because the pandemic can come back to us with new variants. So we need to use all the possible tools to fight the pandemic. One of the tools, not the only one, is to have this patent waiver, which, as Joe said very well, that does not mean that they will, the drug companies will not be paid, but they will not be excessive profits. Now is not the time, well, we should never have the time of excessive profits, but certainly not now when we are talking about millions and millions of human lives. And I think Europe has not lived up to its reputation. Europe should be ahead, should be in front of this. Now, I don't know why there was hesitancy, but again, this shows that Europe is sometimes slow to react, sometimes Europe does not realize the real strengths it does have when it works together and when it makes strong decisions. It is absolutely necessary, of course, not just the waiver of the patent to allow for everyone to produce this drug, but also money for producing the vaccines. We need to put more money into COVAX, which is the WHO initiative of the cooperation between countries, so that there can be more vaccines. And that money is a large amount, but it's very small compared to huge amounts we've already put in for the recovery plans here and in other countries, and of course in the US, and of course very small amount compared to the losses we have because of the lockdowns and the loss of life. So I am very much in agreement with what Joe is talking about. This has been a long-standing problem, but historically this could be a very big step in making sure that pharma serves the common good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And as somebody said recently, I think it was Prime Minister Mitsotakis who said that Europe looks like a big vessel and it takes a lot of time to maneuver, but when it does, then things go to the right direction. Let's hope that it's the case in this scenario. Let me shift a little bit the discussion on the issues of inequality and economic growth. Professor Stίγκλιτς, how is wealth inequality tackled with the Recovery Fund, sponsored by the US government, as we just discussed? And do you think, is that enough to keep poor households from falling behind? And is it enough, or should governments find a way to tackle tax evasion and of course, the wealthiest 1% to sponsor economic growth?
Well, the issue of inequality was with us, as I said before COVID-19, and the virus has not been an equal opportunity virus. It's gone after the poor. It's exacerbated the inequalities in the United States. And we, like many other places, have been very worried about the K-shaped recovery, where those at the bottom who've been so badly affected will also be those who will lag behind in the recovery. That's why it is really important to have a multi-pronged strategy. For the long run, we have to make sure that fewer people grow up in poverty, and that's why the program of reducing childhood poverty by 50% is so important. But this was only for 1 year, and that's where the other parts of President Biden's program are absolutely essential if we're going to make that permanent. Now, you pointed out a very important part of the strategy of dealing with inequality, that while those at the bottom have really had it hard over the last year, the richest Americans have grown richer and richer. And part of the way they've done that is the tax structure allows those at the very, very top to pay a smaller percentage of their income in income taxes than those down below. It's a regressive tax system. And the richest corporations have not been paying their fair share. In fact, a large number of the very richest corporations are paying zero taxes. So the tax reform that President Biden has proposed to help address the issues of that the economy faces are absolutely important. They will reduce inequality, but also give us funds to deal with climate change, poverty, with their infrastructure. You have to see this as a package of really restructuring our economy and our society. And obviously, part of that is going to be resisted. Nobody likes to pay higher taxes, but the fact is, as I said before, those at the very top are actually paying a smaller percentage of their income than those down below, and that's neither efficient nor fair.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Stίγκλιτς. We'll stay in the issue, Mr. Papandreou, of the issue of taxation. What do you think would be some smart ways for to sponsor economic growth in Europe? And I'm just pointing out that there are levels of taxations that vary in European countries. There are different levels of taxation in Ireland or in Bulgaria compared to, or in Cyprus compared to Greece or Germany or other countries. And how do we achieve sustainability goals and climate-friendly policies through smart taxation?
Well, Mr. Manginiadis, I very much agree with what, of course, Joe has said. Mm-hmm. And I would add one element which I think is of great importance. With this inequality, we have the huge concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. But that is not just a question of income inequality. It also is a question of power. Mm-hmm. There is so much power with this money in the hands of these few that they now influence politics, either legally through lobbying or illegally through corruption. There's a lot of money in politics, but not only in politics, but also media, in many areas of our society. So we are undermining our institutions with this huge inequality. That has brought on a reaction to politics, an understandable reaction, but that has been captured very often by demagogues, by authoritarian leaders, and by the sense of isolationism or Brexit or whatever. That's not the solution. The solution is to create a more just system. Secondly, we are facing a huge transformation. We need to have moved towards a green. This is an existential threat. I know that Joe says this very often. An existential threat is the climate change. We need a huge transformation in our energy, in our transport, in our education, in our health systems, in our production, in our agriculture and consumption. But we have to do it with three elements. First of all, it has to be just. It has to be inclusive. We cannot have a transformation which is going to fall and make the poor poorer and the rich richer. That will not work. Not only is it unjust, it will not work. There will be resistance, as we saw in France with the Yellow Jackets. Secondly, it has to be democratic. People have to own this transformation. It has to be part of their daily lives, that they understand what it is and so on. And that also brings me to a third element. It has to be an educative process in our schools, in information, working with scientists, with experts, but of course in the end, our governments will make the decisions. And in Europe, we have, the problem is that they have different, as you mentioned very right, Apostolos, different tax systems. That has hit Greece because we had to have higher taxes, and many Greek companies moved to other places to have lower taxes. But this is a global issue. But Europe can solve it if we start, first of all, harmonizing our taxes. I know there's resistance from countries like Ireland or from like Luxembourg, Holland, maybe others, but we need to harmonize taxes. Secondly, there are types of taxes we could impose as a European tax. We are now getting Eurobonds. We're using Eurobonds. So we're borrowing as a European Union. Well, we will need to repay these debts. But we can do that if we have more resources. And the European Union only has about 1% of its GDP as of the total GDP of Europe is in the European Union. Very, very small. Mm-hmm. So we could have taxes on greenhouse gases like CO2. We could have financial transaction taxes. Actually, we pushed this through the European Parliament. Our socialist group pushed this through the European Parliament 10 years ago, but it never became law in final law in Europe. Wealth taxes or fighting tax havens. That's huge amounts of monies that are being lost. So there are measures where Europe can really work, and I think work with the United States in order to make a more just playing field globally, so that these corporations don't escape the responsibilities and they are stripping away the possibility of governments to actually invest in the infrastructures, in the social infrastructure, in education infrastructure, in R&D, and basically in the transition to a green economy.
Thank you, Mr. Papandreou. Let me wrap this discussion up by asking the following. I think that the pandemic has been an accelerator for various things. For example, digital transformation. And we saw that in Greece happening, and we saw that in other places too. But I somehow feel that the pandemic has worked as an accelerator for a paradigm shift, for a return to what Keynes wrote maybe some 100 years ago. We're seeing some Roosevelt-style politics in the 21st century, and that comes after 30 years of a dominance of liberal politics, where the state was considered to be a problem and not the solution. And I would like to ask Professor Stίγκλιτς your view on the issue, if we're now facing a new era in politics where state has a very concrete role to play.
I very much agree with that perspective, and I think you can see it in two ways. Actually, it goes back 40 years to Reagan and Thatcher, and they made all kinds of promises that it would lead to more growth from which everybody would benefit. Actually, the rate of growth in this neoliberal era was about 2/3 of what it was prior to neoliberalism. And trickle-down economics didn't work. The only people who benefited were the people at the very top. Those at the bottom actually saw not only their income stagnate, but in many cases actually decline. So that was the one thing. The promise of neoliberalism absolutely failed. The second one is that it didn't actually prepare us for COVID-19. One of the important functions of the state is facing risks. We saw that in 2008 in the crisis, the Euro crisis. Everybody turned to government. And now, when we face a pandemic, we again turn to government. But because we had taken away the strength of the governments in some countries were not able to respond effectively. And citizens hopefully will recognize that collectively, we can do things that we can't do individually. We have to get a better balance between the market, the state, and civil society. And that is what I hope will come out as the positive silver lining out of this terrible episode, is that it's a wake-up call for us to try to get that better balance that obviously has been missing for 4 decades now.
I keep that silver lining. Thank you so much, Professor Stίγκλιτς. And Mr. Papandreou, we have a couple of minutes for your take on that.
Again, of course, I agree with Joe. And 10 years ago, it was the states that bailed out the banks. Mm-hmm. It was not the private sector that bailed out the banks. Mm-hmm. Unluckily, these bailouts often helped make the bankers richer and a lot of people poorer. Today, it is the states, it is the governments that are dealing with the pandemic. The private sector could not do it alone. As a matter of fact, the private sector we talked about earlier, pharma, which has done great work in research, but much of that money in research is from taxpayers' money, but they are resisting really serving the public good in the best of ways. And I would say one thing more. The state also has to transform itself, because it's not true that the state has always been in helping the public good. I believe that the neoliberals were actually using the state to make rules, because we talk about regulation. They were making regulation for their own interests. It's not that they didn't want regulation. They didn't want regulation that was helping others and not providing for them. So, of course, Donald Trump made regulation by cutting taxes, but that helped the rich. Now we're talking about regulation which is going to be more just and going to help people. And of course, in Greece, we went through a problem that the state, I don't want to make a god out of the state, as I don't want the market to be a god. The god should be serving the public. In Greece, we have a state which had many problems. It still has a lot of clientelism, very highly bureaucratic. We need to make a good state, so the state really does serve its populations. I think this is an opportunity. Money that is coming to Greece, money that is coming to our society, has to be used. And there's a lot of money. I said that many years ago and people laughed, but today there is a lot of money. Yeah. The question is where it is going to go. And it has to be used to modernize our state, to make it more efficient in favor of serving our citizens and the public good.
Yeah, we have to acknowledge that you've said many things 10 years ago, but very few were listening, unfortunately. But thank you very much.
Joe and I talked about that a lot, and he always was a very good guide and good advisor in those difficult times, and a good friend, of course, even more important.
All right. Professor Stίγκλιτς, it was an honor and a privilege to have you today with Delphi Forum. Thank you very much. Hopefully, as I said in the beginning, at some point we'll see you back in Greece.
Hope to see you soon, Joe.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it.
Great.